Okay, so we're back again with another discussion of Jürgen Habermas's theory and practice. And the main topics that are covered in this section are the transition from a Kantian viewpoint to Hegel's viewpoint. That is to say, the way in which Hegel disagrees with Kant and forms a new philosophical viewpoint of his own. And Hegel's remarks on language, at least what Habermas is able to bring forth from Hegel's Jena lectures on language, and the subject of labor, again, within that context. So I thought we would begin with a quote from the beginning of section 3 that'll set things up. So it reads, because Hegel does not link the constitution of the I to the reflection of the solitary I on itself, but instead understands it in terms of formative processes, namely the communicative agreement of opposing subjects, it is not reflection as such which is decisive, but rather the medium in which the identity of the universal and the individual is formed. So, taken out of context, this sentence may appear mystifying, but we can try to clear that mist away by just bringing this back into the context of Kant having a discussion, or rather Hegel having a discussion with Kant. So, taking the first clause here, because Hegel does not link the constitution of the I to the reflection on the solitary I on itself, but understands it in terms of formative processes. Okay, let's just stop there in those two clauses. So the constitution of the I, reflection of the solitary I on itself. Those are the two phrases that we can focus on to begin to bring some more light to this. So for Hegel, the I is going to be something that's constituted, and the I is going to be something that appears as consciousness becoming aware of itself, the subject coming to know itself as an object. In other words, having a sense of your identity, who you are. And that word constitution brings us into the middle of things, so to speak, into the middle of Hegel's project of seeing the world, our understanding of the world, our knowledge of the world, as mediated by our consciousness. If we look at that next phrase, reflection of the solitary I on itself, we can see that Hegelian viewpoint juxtaposed with the Kantian viewpoint, which does not involve emphasis on the constitution of the I, but simply reflection of the solitary I on itself. So Kant's project is more like the Cartesian project than a project like Hegel's that wants to take into account the context of the society or the history in which the individual is forming their own self-consciousness and identity. For Kant, everything begins with a solitary thinker reflecting upon the contents of his or her own consciousness with the ultimate aim of being able to arrive at knowledge with a capital K, if possible, or knowledge with a capital T, if possible, insofar as that is possible. So his project, that is Kant's project, is a very Cartesian one. It starts as a solitary thinker reflecting upon the contents of his own consciousness, trying to reason his way out toward what could be called a transcendental position, toward something that allows the subject to extend his knowledge beyond himself, toward what could be considered the objective world in which real knowledge is possible. Knowledge that is purely subjective is always going to be subject to that very objection. Knowledge needs to be objective if it's going to be real knowledge. Okay, so there we have the juxtaposition of the Kantian viewpoint and the Hegelian viewpoint. One is emphasizing the constitution of the subject, the constitution of the subject's consciousness. The other is taking that more or less as a given and beginning to reflect on itself. Okay, and then next clause, but instead understands it in terms of formative processes. That is, Hegel understands the formation, the constitution, the development of one's consciousness in terms of formative processes. And here they are, namely, the communicative agreement of opposing subjects. So there's kind of an advertisement for what is going to be discussed in this section, which is communicative agreement, i.e., language, and the way in which opposing subjects are using language to represent the world. And now, starting from the beginning again, just to give the full thought its proper room to be expressed, because Hegel does not link the constitution of the I to the reflection of the solitary I on itself, but instead understands it in terms of formative processes, namely the communicative agreement of opposing subjects. And now it is not reflection as such which is decisive, but rather the medium in which the identity of the universal and the individual is formed. So Hegel is going to have a shift of emphasis away from reflection as such toward the medium in which the identity of the universal and individual is formed. So with the universal and individual, we have a dialectical opposition, and it's through the mediation of the consciousness as a thinker, as a knower, as something that's attempting to understand the world. Through that mediative activity, its identity, its sense of itself in relation to the world and how it understands itself in relation to the world is going to begin to take shape. And that's the dialectic of the universal and the individual. Okay, so if we reflect on that for just a moment, Habermas is beginning to frame a picture of what Hegel is all about. What Hegel is all about is a project that starts by looking at consciousness as a medium rather than consciousness as a basis for knowledge. So that medium is going to be something that has to be subject at all times to dialectical oppositions. So in this case, it's the universal and the individual. It could be truth versus falsity. You could think of a lot of different opposing ideas that consciousness has to mediate. Self and other. Hegel discusses the master-slave relationship. These are the different oppositions that exist in the world that consciousness has to find its way in and find its understanding of itself within. So understanding, knowledge is always going to be contextualized. We can't just take for granted that the contents of our consciousness are simply just there to be reflected upon, to gain knowledge about. But now we can begin to think about consciousness as having another dimension, which is a historical dimension, and that historical dimension includes cultural development. And so this Hegelian viewpoint, insofar as Habermas is putting the picture together, it really looks a lot like the postmodern conception of the self. The self has to be understood as situated, and because the self is the medium through which any of us is going to be able to find our understanding of things, find our knowledge of things, find our truth, insofar as we can experience it and grasp it in this world, that truth, that understanding is always going to be contextualized. If there is a truth, if there is a knowledge to be had, it is to be had within that framework. If we can certify knowledge as something that is genuine, is real, that's attainable, it's attainable insofar as we can specify the context within we've been able to certify it. So that's going to depend on things like language, certainly. And Habermas uses the word system in relation to language to kind of bring that through. The philosophy of language has done a lot to make people aware that there is a kind of system, a kind of order that's embedded in language that may influence us all the time, subconsciously. Foucault has done a lot to try to bring out the kinds of tacit assumptions that are involved with knowledge claims through different historical periods. One argument that I've heard made that might bring this point together just a little bit more is the idea that, from a certain point of view, Ptolemaic astronomy is correct. And the argument would just go that, given the assumption that what counts for the truth of the Ptolemaic picture is actually just the individual being able to look out and see the sun revolving around the earth, from that specific point of view, and just from that point of view, from within that framework of self-understanding, you might say, within that way of seeing the world, the sun goes around the earth. But of course, once we've developed a different point of view, once we've been able to prove beyond a doubt and mathematically and go into outer space and take a look at the sun and our relation to the sun, the relationship between the sun and the earth, from that point of view, from that expansion of our consciousness, the Copernican view that the earth goes around the sun is the correct view. But the only thing that separates the truth and the falsity of the other is really the context and what's going on in the mind of the person who's making that knowledge claim when they're trying to say that the sun goes around the earth. Okay, so you may or may not want to buy that, but it fits to a certain degree. Maybe it fits entirely well within the phenomenological point of view. And what we mean by phenomenological point of view really coincides with the passage that I just went over, which is just that consciousness is going to be the foundation for our awareness, understanding, knowledge of the world around us. And within that framework, the way that we're going to generate knowledge, understanding, truth is by looking at the contents of our own awareness. So when we see a lamp or a pencil or a notepad, we're not going to view those things just as objects, as things out there, but we're going to be viewing them with the added understanding, the added conscious awareness that they are contents of our consciousness. They are, in a sense, creations of our perception. Other animals have different modes of perception. Bats have sonar, and some people are colorblind, and we can come up with all sorts of examples of ways in which our perception of things may be affected in such a way that it affects the way that we see the world and the kinds of things that we would claim that we know about the world. So, a phenomenological framework, just to bring that point through, is a framework in which the world is really a something contained within our conscious awareness, that it all comes back to our perception, that our perceptions of things are, as such, the foundation for our knowledge, which is a point that goes back to Descartes when he made the argument that I can't be deceived in the fact that when I perceive something, I do perceive it. So at least there is some bedrock truth there. But neither Descartes nor the phenomenologists, and Hegel is one of the founding fathers of phenomenology, is willing to go past the point of saying that my perceptions reveal the actual objective truth of the world around me. The furthest I can go is to say, I have this perception, treat that as a basic fact, treat it as a basic datum, you might say, and then build on that. Now, the difficulty with that is that leads to a solipsistic point of view. And it circles back to the point I made earlier about knowledge. If it's just subjective, then it's always going to be conditioned knowledge or conditional knowledge. It's true for me, but I can't certify that it's really objective knowledge, So what's true is true for me. So I can make a knowledge claim as far as that goes. And many phenomenologists that I've talked to don't seem to feel that there's any real difficulty with this because, well, if all you're given are the contents of your consciousness, and that is your world, and there's no way to get out of that to find some objective world, then the given is the given. And that simply is the world as such, period. So what's the problem there? Well, the problem is the assumption is that what is true for me really is true. And then if that assumption is made and it's carried into the idea of intersubjective communication as a way of getting outside of or beyond that subjective immediate experience of the world, well, it doesn't quite do that work because you're never quite getting outside of your perceptions of the world. Even within the framework of language, that language is always based upon your perceptions of the world. So strictly speaking, everything that you experience is subjective, and therefore the kinds of knowledge that you're able to derive from subjective experiences will be subjective. Let's move on, and let's take a look at what Habermas has to say about Hegel and language. So he says, language does not already embrace the communication of subjects living together and acting. Rather, here it means only the employment of symbols by the solitary individual who confronts nature and gives names to things. In immediate perception, the spirit is still animalistic. Hegel speaks of the nighttime production of the representational faculty of imagination, of the fluid and not yet organized realm of images. Only with the appearance of language and within language do consciousness and the being of nature begin to separate for consciousness. So if we just look at the first part here, language does not already embrace the communication of subjects living together and acting. Here it means only the employment of symbols by the solitary individual who confronts nature and gives names to things. My comment on that would be just simply that what I think Habermas has in mind is just reminding us that we're looking at a pre-Wittgensteinian way of looking at language. This is going to be more of an Augustinian approach, where we might presume that with the first man and the first woman, uh, as far as the Garden of Eden story is concerned, Adam was there and he began pointing at things and naming them. He began giving them names. And then, when we move on to the next few lines, in immediate perception, the spirit is still animalistic. Hegel speaks of the nighttime production of the representational faculty of imagination, of the fluid and not yet organized realm of images. So, as things come to be named, as they come to be given names and recognized, they come to have a symbolic value, and our consciousness, our awareness of the world begins to take shape. An example that I could give that would maybe help to clarify the point here, what I think Habermas is trying to bring out from his reading of Hegel, would be something like the experience of entering into a rainforest. And there's a vast difference in the degree of conscious awareness that a native would have, somebody who lives in the rainforest, who knows what every plant is called, what every tree is called, what every animal is called, the medicinal properties of all the plants and the names that they have, the birds, and so on and so forth. But as an outsider, just coming into the rainforest without having names for any of these objects, our level of awareness, the distinctness with which we recognize what's going on around us, is probably much, much less than the awareness and the distinctness with which the native is able to view that environment. So, language, and with it that first move of naming things, taking for granted for a moment that Augustinian viewpoint on language, is a way of developing one's consciousness. And again, we can circle back to the point of a dialectic coming into play here. So in this case, we could say that the dialectical relationship might be simply self and other, or subject and object, stated in the most general terms. As the subject goes into the rainforest, confronted with hundreds, maybe thousands of different objects. As those objects come to be named, they come to have a distinct reality. They can then become objects of knowledge. And this works pretty well with what happens in the next paragraph, which is that Habermas discusses a little bit more the value of naming things. So it reads, as the name of things, the symbol has a double function. On the one hand, the power of representation consists in making present something that is not immediately given through something else that is immediately given, but which stands for something other than itself. And then one line down, or one sentence further, on the other hand, we ourselves have produced the symbols. By means of them, speaking consciousness becomes objective for itself, and in them experiences itself as a subject. So the first part breaks down what you might call the mechanics of symbolization. So we have these names for things. Adam walks around in the Garden of Eden and he points and he calls the creature he sees a lion. But once that is done, the word lion, the name, comes to be a symbol. And as Habermas says, it has a power of representation It consists in making present something that is not immediately given. In other words, we can call up the image of a lion by thinking of the word lion. Making present something that is not immediately given through something else that is immediately given. So that would be the image of the lion. So as long as we, again, using that Augustinian framework, can rely upon our memory to bring these contents of our consciousness, to restore them to our consciousness, to restore these names of things along with the images that they bring up, we can begin to contemplate them as objects. So on the first move here, on the first part of this discussion of what symbols do, we could say that a symbol allows us to step away from the immediate given flow of experience and begin to contemplate things as objects that we've experienced. So that's a very important move in the development of consciousness, awareness of the world. And of course, this fits together very well with the idea of developing a phenomenology of the world. Okay. And then the second part, we ourselves have produced the symbols. By means of them, speaking consciousness becomes objective for itself, and in them experiences itself as a subject. So there we have the second move. So not only are we able to contemplate something in our experience as an object, and now we've distinguished subject and object, but through that move, we begin to understand ourselves as objects. So now I am the thinker. I am the thing that's thinking about the lion, which isn't present now. And it's through that move of being able to first objectify something by treating it as a symbol that I become aware of myself and who I am. So now I begin to understand that I am not the lion, that is the lion, I am the thing that's thinking about the lion, and begin to formulate a sense of my own identity. This is who I am. I'm not the lion. This is how I'm different from the lion. And all the different names and ways that I have of describing the lion versus the way that I am, whether it's having sharp teeth or not being nearly as aggressive a predator as the lion or whatever it might be, are further ways that I'm able to look at myself as an object of my own thought. And that moment can only arise by having first distinguished an object through symbolizing it in some way. So we're building up a phenomenology and circling back to the point that what Hegel wants to do is link knowledge, truth, and understanding to the constitution of the I. We're on track with what Hegel ultimately wants to do as part of his philosophical project. The last line of that paragraph reads, "In this, spirit is the logos of a world and not a solitary self-consciousness." So the word logos there in Greek and in a way that was made use of by early Christians carries with it the idea that there is a language, that there is a way that we can frame the world by means of language that gives us access to the way things are. And the project of framing things, describing things through language, doing the work, you could extend it to the metaphor of the craftsman that Hegel uses. The crafting that goes into describing the world in better and better ways is the medium through which, or you could even say the bridge by which, we come to have a more thorough, better, consistent understanding of the world, which is going to be the path to the only real kind of knowledge that we can have. And this is not something that's going to be achieved by a solitary self consciousness. We have to think about these things in terms of a development of one's consciousness if we're to have the proper viewpoint. So, in the following paragraph, Hegel discusses labor. So, the text reads, labor, Hegel calls that specific mode of satisfying drives, which distinguishes existing spirit from nature. Just as language breaks the dictates of immediate perception and orders the chaos of the manifold impressions into identifiable things, so labor breaks the dictates of immediate desires and, as it were, arrests the process of drive satisfaction. So, with labor, we have a second way in which consciousness begins to develop. And it is a very primitive way, just as language is a very primitive moment in the development of consciousness. Labor begins with desire. So you might think of desire as beginning with an object. So with desire, we presuppose something that is desired. Okay, and as part of this dialectic, there's me, or there is the subject, and then there is the thing that is desired. And once that relationship is established, once somebody becomes aware of that thing versus me, we have another dialectical point that's set up, self and other. I as the thing that desires, the thing out there as the thing that is desired. And a further move that Habermas doesn't get to is the next step that is reached in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit is the self that is desiring thinks about himself or herself in a social context and wants to be an object of desire. So there's a threefold movement: self, desiring an object, and then partly mediated perhaps by language itself, in which things attain symbolic value as either desirable to a greater or lesser degree. Individuals in society decide that they want to be recognized. There is a need for recognition that is just innately part of what we are. And that expresses itself as a desire to be desired, to be valued in some way. And that can be affected by the kinds of symbolic interpretations that we give of things as we compare ourselves with other people and how we value them. This discussion can take us directly into semiotics. And I think a very easy way to kind of cut through some of the difficulties that sometimes arise with this topic is to just think about everyday objects as symbols and the kind of value that we give them purely through the way in which we frame them as symbols. So if there is a Mercedes out there, maybe we would say that it has a certain symbolic value. Maybe it connotes some sort of upper class lifestyle that people would agree is something valuable. If a media outlet has somebody that has made racist remarks, the media outlet might decide to fire the person who's made those remarks simply because their brand has a symbolic value and they don't want people to associate their brand with something that we culturally deem to be something negative. So this enters into all aspects of society, and when applied to human beings, it's that desire for recognition, the desire, in some sense, to be desired, to be thought worthy, valuable, important, etc., has to do with that dialectical interplay between desire and wanting to be desired. Um, and that's another very important aspect of this discussion of labor. What are we laboring for? What is the telos of our labor? What is the end toward which we are striving? Quite often, it's simply the desire for recognition, the desire to be acknowledged and recognized by the other. And when we place that desire in the context of what Hegel calls the master-slave dialectic, the slave is in the position where the slave is struggling for recognition. And, it's I think that discussion, although it is framed as a master on the one hand and slave on the other, I think it is something that you can generalize to any situation where somebody feels like they are under the domination of somebody else. People in their office jobs, they don't feel like they are quite free, struggling for their um, fuller expression of themselves and who they are, and struggling for recognition. They're in the position of the slave who Hegel thinks needs to work toward that freedom and can achieve it, and can achieve that recognition through labor. And the kind of labor that ultimately is going to make that possible and achievable will be a kind of labor that develops one's consciousness and awareness of oneself. That takes me maybe to just clearing up last few points here. I'll throw in a few more quotes. Just like language, the tool is a category of the middle by means of which spirit attains existence. But the two movements pursue opposing courses. The name-giving consciousness achieves a different position with respect to the objectivity of the spirit than does the cunning consciousness that arises from the process of labor. So it's through the process of labor that one begins to achieve mastery. So it's that moment of achieving mastery that this term cunning consciousness begins to arise. And what Hegel has in mind here is just that moment of no longer being in a position of subjection to something, but having a kind of mastery or dominion over it. So we could think of maybe a scientist figuring something out in their laboratory that will allow them to, instead of being subject to nature's whim, to have a kind of dominion over their circumstances. And that, in turn, further separates them as subject from nature as an object. So with that point, let me just conclude with what Habermas says at the end of the section. The identity of the knowing subject is one that has first to be formed to the same degree as the objectivity of the recognizing subject, to the same degree as the objectivity of the recognized objects first arises with language, within which alone the synthesis of the divergent elements of the I and of nature is possible as a world of the I. So if you wanted a statement that kind of nicely encapsulates, nicely frames exactly what phenomenology is all about, what its aims are, and kind of the dynamic aspects that are involved in how it develops itself. It has to do, first of all, with consciousness as a medium. So we have the self, we have the world. Consciousness is something that's constructed, it's something that's framed, not just not just by language, not just by labor, but by the two of them working together. And you can extend the idea of labor also to, let's say, spiritual activities in which an individual is focused on contemplating and developing a better understanding of themselves in relation to the world. Let's not forget a moral, ethical aspect to this, how we as individuals understand ourselves in relation to other people, the kinds of things that we decide are good, things that are to be avoided in our experience of the world. So, and notice the word identity. The identity of the knowing subject is one that first has to be formed to the same degree of the object as the objectivity of the recognized objects. So here you could say we have another dialectical point. There's the identity of self, there's the identity of other, and Habermas phrases it in such a way that you could say that one is kind of a function of the other. Our growing sense of the world and how to identify things as we go into the rainforest and start identifying everything around us um, enables us to develop our consciousness to the same degree that we're able to begin to develop our own identity. So one goes hand in hand with the other. As I begin to understand the world better, I begin to understand who I am a little bit better. And there may be an aspect of negativity there where I begin saying, okay, here's a lion, here's the way in which I'm not a lion. Here's a giraffe, here's a way in which I'm not a giraffe. And I can go through the world and take on that negative way of looking at things. I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not that, which again is another Augustinian way of proceeding. You could say it has its roots in Neoplatonism as the via negativa. So I'm not this, I'm not that. Through this way of interacting with the world, I begin to understand who I am as opposed to those other things. And then maybe you reach a point where you begin to have certain ideas about who you are. You begin applying certain attributes to yourself. A thinker, a knower, a believer, a person who has faith in something or does not have faith in something, beliefs about certain things being good or bad, etc. Okay, and the last part here, within which, and that is the consciousness of self and other and the development of identity, within which alone the synthesis of the divergent elements of the I and of nature is possible as a world of the I. So the world of the I is the framework for the development of this phenomenological point of view. And as I said a while ago, because the phenomenological point of view takes the I to be the world, as Habermas says, it is possible as a world of the I. The danger that phenomenology falls into, I believe, and other people have argued against it, but I think it has to be brought into the picture. The difficulty is falling into solipsism, The world simply is my consciousness of it. And once you give way to that, your knowledge claims, your attempts to arrive at capital K knowledge or capital T truth fall down if the assumption is that this is knowledge for you. This is my knowledge, because all your knowledge is conditioned only by your own perception of the world, and you haven't arrived at a solution for how to get from the subjective to the objective. So I think that in spite of everything you could say about language and intersubjectivity, that is, having communication with other people around you and what sort of arguments you might want to make, by saying that language definitely implies an other in order for communication to take place. Strictly speaking, if you're framing the world as an I, as a stream of perceptions, that is a solipsistic worldview. And so you really haven't resolved the problem of objective knowledge. You can't claim that your knowledge is objective, that what goes on inside your head is anything more than just a stream of perceptions without any other basic foundational reality to them. So, as far as I can see it, I don't think that when we arrive at Hegel, we've actually resolved the problem that Descartes initially had in trying to reason from first principles, from his consciousness of himself as something that's self-certifying, self-certifiably true. I think, therefore I am, and arrive at some truth of things existing outside himself was ever actually solved within the continental tradition. And that's not to say that it was ever solved in the empirical tradition either, in the tradition of empiricism in Anglo-American philosophy. Both strands of philosophy, both sects, you might say, the continental and the analytic, both have to make the assumption that the given is a starting point for knowledge if they're going to make any progress toward any kind of knowledge. And so I'll end it there, and good night.